What's happening in the canine industry? For all the latest news, views, and expert opinions, stay right here for the Canine Paradigm. You'll hear from industry leaders, experts, doyens of the industry, learned colleagues, movers and shakers, and the odd randy guest. Get the latest insights and expert advice from both here and abroad from the people in the know. Now, here are your hosts, Glenn Cook and Pat Stewart. And I'm Lofty Fulton, and I'm out of here.
Glenda?
Yes.
We have to do a new ad.
We do.
It's a solemn time. Our long-time sponsor of the show, George Kittredge,
Yes.
very, very sadly passed away. And we formerly used to advertise for him his Rowdy Hound boxes.
We did.
So we don't actually know what's happened with Rowdy Hound boxes. You know anything about that?
I looked at the website. It said that they're recalibrating since their founder and boss has passed. But nonetheless, I think that you and I want to honour the memory of George Kittredge anyway. He was a friend to both of us, a hell of a good guy, and he supported us almost immediately. He was on board through and through, and I just don't want any of us to forget George. He was a terrific human being.
So we intend to continue to advertise Rowdy Hound, even though we don't know what's going on with them, in the hopes that they keep going, and that can be a bit of George's legacy that we're able to continue to promote.
I hope so.
In checking it out, we had a look to see, because we're not real good with the sponsorship. So we had a look to see who's actually paying for sponsorship. And we have a list of people to tell you that we support. And the first is our sugar mama, Barbara de Groot.
She's been with us from the start as well. Barbara's been an absolute staple in our...
She's a gem.
She is a gem.
She has a business.
She does. From the Heart Dog Training.
From the Heart Dog Training.
Yeah.
You can check it out. But she supports us as much and more than anybody ever has. So we appreciate you very much, Barbara. Another person who's supported us from the start.
The Einzelwiener.
Einzelwiener.
The Bullfed.
The Bullfed.
Yep.
It's where I get all my stuff.
Yeah.
It is, truly. It's where I get all my dog gear. If I need something, Jason's my first point of call. I don't use his shit website. He has a website. It's dog shit. I just message him directly. You guys probably should use his shit website, but I don't.
Yeah, because you don't want to message him directly and get his grumpy ire of the day.
Yeah, but do it. Get all your dog stuff from Jason. He's got everything you need. He's got all the shit that you need to train a dog for realty.
Everybody who comes to seminars and looks at mills and asks me mills questions, ask Jason.
Yeah.
Jason can point you in the right direction for getting the mill that's best suited for you.
I really like his leashes. I'm a big fan of his leash pack. That's why I sort of convinced him to do it. But anyway, get your stuff from Einzelwiener.
Yep.
Do you know who has a fantastic website and ships internationally?
My wife?
Your wife,
Yeah.
Canine Paradigm.
I couldn't imagine her not having a good website, how much of a perfectionist she is.
Well, the products are amazing. My dog merely being alive is a walking testimonial to that. My dog, who I've retired numerous times and has come out of retirement when I've managed to get his body back to healthy, and a big part of that is related to Canine Paradigm. So check it out, everybody.
I could say so many nice and biased things about Canine Paradigm and my wife, but what I will say is ignore me. Just look at testimonials. The testimonials speak for themselves. That's where the field trials are working. What makes Narelle's day, and mine as well, is when people are emailing in and sending messages of, well, primarily people have had no hope in the past because just everything that they were trying wasn't working, and now it is. And that is the testament that something is actually really working. And the other thing, which I will add, one of the things that Narelle's told me in the past is dogs are incapable of understanding the placebo effect.
Oh, that's a good point.
So you can fake it on a human, but you can't fake it on a dog.
I never thought about that before. That's actually a really good point.
Well, my wife's actually a very smart person.
There you go.
So she's told me that humans are subject to the placebo effect where dogs are not. So it either works or it doesn't on dogs.
There you go. That makes total sense.
Yep.
There's one other person who puts a fair amount of work into this show.
Yeah.
It's me.
Yeah. Funny about that.
And I have a digital product that you can buy. If you go to my website, seriousdogbusiness.com, right now I've got 2 courses available to you. The Overview, which is a small course where you could learn how I teach.
Yep.
But the other one is the Wave Tops, which is a bigger course. It's everything I know about dog training. Well, it's not everything. It's a lot of what I know about dog training.
Yeah,
Check it out.
terrific. Yeah.
$500 dues. That's all it's going to cost you.
I recommended when people are saying, what do I do? How do I get in the industry? I recommend them to your course.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks,
Yeah.
sir. All right, on with the show. Welcome back to the Canine Paradigm. I'm your host, Pat Stewart. I'm joined today by my co-host, Glenn Cook.
Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Good. Let's get into it because you've got a topic in mind. Sounds like a good
Let's
one.
get straight into some dog training. Never mind that the world's on fire and nuclear war and aliens.
Yeah.
Do you remember when we started the Patreon? I think it was one of the early episodes. Like it had to be in the first 10 for sure. We did an audio Patreon one on luring to shaping and everything in between.
I do.
I thought maybe we could revisit that. I thought that it might be fun to sort of discuss, I guess, the process of teaching a dog to do anything and tease out a little bit the differences, the pros and cons, if you will, of luring to free shaping and all the steps in between.
Mm-hmm. It's such a good topic. Everything that we're doing is shaping anyway. Like we're constantly shaping on a daily basis, intentionally or not intentionally. Like if we don't pay credence to what the dog is actually paying attention to, we're foolish to think that our dogs are not shaping through behaviors. For example, I put a clip up of myself on social media, and when you do that, you're open to the criticisms of people. It was just part of my story. It was up for 24 hours and then it disappeared. When I feed my dogs, I get them to do a behavior. I got some flack from that from a few people who probably don't know much about dog behavior, who were just following me in the background, and they said, why don't you just give the dog the food? And that's come up a few times. When I put those clips up there, they've said, why do you have to mess with them so much? Why don't you just give them the food? And I respond to people like that because I feel it warrants an answer. And I said, you're training your dog whether you like it or not, whether you're doing those things. So if you just walk out there and give them food, it's not that your dog's not thinking about some mechanics along the way. Your dog's not just thinking, oh, I'm at liberty, he's just going to give me food. Your dog is thinking, okay, why did this happen this way? Or every time I do these behaviors, or if I create this little superstitious pattern, which you're not acutely aware of the time, it can actually flow into something which later on you think, that behavior actually pisses me off. I wish my dog didn't do that. Because it's 2 years into it, it's really well entrenched in the neurological pathway of the dog. And now the dog's doing the behavior, so good luck fucking carving that back out. When the dog likes it and kind of thinks, well, mate, 2 years, you and I have been doing these behaviors. Like you shaped me into this manic sort of behavior where I do this little hop, skip and jump and hip and shoulder you into the wall as you're trying to get the food around the corner or whatever we're doing. Like it's a bit of a comedy show. You spill some food, I pick it up off the ground. That's my first big reward. And then you put the food down and swear and curse and walk off. But for me, it's a big game. It's no wonder that dog trainers are in demand or in vogue, and we've always got a cascade of work to do, is because people don't realize, yeah, man, you're shaping. You're doing the things that you don't want to do, you're not acutely aware of. I love those conversations. I used to get pissed off when people did it, and I used to think, what the fuck? Like, why are you telling me what to do? But now it's now it's a capability, and I even templated it. I actually created a templated point, because anytime I put things up, it may not be a lot of people, but there's always one who will say it. And there's enough. And even family members have said it to me in the past, where they've said, oh, why do you do that? Like, why do you make your dogs do that thing? Why don't you just give them the food? And I said, good question. And then I go bang with the template, and they read it and they go, oh, I wasn't aware of any of that. And I said, yeah, cool. That's what we do as dog trainers, is we bring awareness to you about certain criteria and behaviors that manifest over a period of time and how you accidentally shape them into existence. And now the dog thinks this is a normal part of life, and sometimes even thinks, now if you don't do the criteria, I have to accelerate in the way I behave, because maybe that's it. And I'll push you into those behaviors. So yeah, I know you're itching and chafing at the bit to go.
Exactly. I love the fact that you want to define shaping, right? So, and let's get to that in a moment. But on your story of feeding your dog, I don't make my dogs do anything before they eat, right? Because they're in my house with my kids. We have this kind of routine that we go through. Both my dogs eat from a bowl twice a day, unless we come down here and we're training for food in the morning. The only time I'm training with food with my 2 geriatric dogs now is when they do their rehab stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So like Remy has a really cool program that I got from Rebecca. I should actually give all her details. I'll do that later on. We use food to shape those things and to train those things. But for the most part, both my dogs just eat from a bowl twice a day. But we have this routine. Valerie has a really high food drive. Like in the wrong home, she would be borderline dangerous, like food aggression, right? Mm-hmm. Like she's not at all for us, but the capacity to be that is there within her. I totally see that. And interestingly, she always had a very high food drive. But after being desexed, she had an extremely high food drive, right? It definitely, affected her hormones and whatever it is, like however that affected her. I'm not sure how that mechanism plays out, but observably her food drive got significantly higher after being desexed. She's also a very possessive dog and dominant over my Mally. So I have to feed them, now they can eat right next to each other, but why take those risks, right? So they eat in their kennels. It's almost the only time that they're actually in their kennels is when they eat. But the moment I pick up the food bowls, right, whether they come out of I pick them up from the kennel and bring them inside the washer, I get them out of the washing machine, the dishwasher, whatever, Valerie loses her mind, right? So she does this twirl, no matter where she is. She does this twirl on the spot, and then she runs out and jumps into her kennel and sits there in a sit pretty position, like a beg, right? So she sits all the way back on her hind legs, tucks her little front legs in like little T-Rex arms and sits there waiting. And that came about from years ago when Rip was feeding her and he was, slow to bring the bowl in, and she was kind of lifting and ended up multiple times in that position. That's a trick she knows. It's a thing that I can say to do on command. And she must have misinterpreted that she was being lured into that position with the food bowl, with this, with like little probably, maybe 4-year-old Rip trying to feed her at the time. And so what she does is the moment I start prepping the food, she runs out to the kennel and jumps in the kennel and sits there in the sit pretty position waiting for the food to come out. And without a doubt, if you were to ask her, why are you doing that? She would that's what they want. Like, I was lured into this position. I was trained specifically to do this. This is what I do. I've never asked her to do it. One of my things that I'll do to her every now and again, because Remy doesn't go, right? Like, Remy has a very, mediocre food drive. So he just waits with me in the kitchen. He just watches me prep the stuff and then walks out casually with me when it's time to actually be fed, jumps in his kennel, waits for me to put the food in the ground. So he doesn't go out there with her. Every now and again, because I think it's funny, me and Remy will just kind of stand there talking to each other, just outweight her, right? And she'll bark once, right? She'll be like, hey, I'm still out here waiting. And then, maybe if I leave it another 10 seconds, she'll start barking full steam and she'll come charging into the house and bark at both of us. Okay, get back out there. And then I go, righto, out we go. Now, I'm aware of the monster I've created and I love it. To me, that's hilarious. None of those are dangerous behaviors because I've got it all, it's all controlled. It's just funny. It's something I enjoy to do with my dogs. It builds a bit of, she gets to feel something. I'm sure it's not super repetitive for her in that moment, but she gets to tap into some frustration and come in and bark at me and sort of boss me around. And then I go out and feed her. I'm aware of all the problems that could come of that and I'm totally okay with them. But it proves your point in that I don't do those control things because I don't feel the need to in the space that I have with the dogs that I have. Certainly I do that with certain dogs that I have for sure. But with my two at the moment, they're pretty free and loose in the house. But you said something pretty interesting. And I remember you saying this when we first spoke on this topic, is that what definitely has entered my language is to call free shaping. So I want to sort of put that out in front of the rest of the conversation that we're going to have, is that the overarching term to say shaping really means any of the types of ways to train a dog to do anything. By shaping, we actually mean that you are slowly building a behavior, right? And so no matter the technique that you're actually using to build that behavior, whether it is free shaping, capturing, molding, prompting, luring, and all the things in between, all of those kind of go under the banner of shaping, right? That's how you use the word.
Well, the reason we discussed this in the first place is I just think there was a misuse or a misalignment of the word free shaping, in that people were predominantly using free shaping while they were mechanically intervening with the dog. And I think that while you're doing that, when the dog has started to see that there is like a mechanics project going where you're doing something with the dog and the dog is receiving payment for it, that is very much orchestrated behavior. So that's no longer free shaping, where the dog is just doing a behavior and then you pay the dog and the dogs think, where did that come from? And why did I receive that? So in the first part of that criteria, while the dog is very unawares of what is going on, I would definitely consider that free shaping, because you're sort of capturing something very raw. It's not premeditated. It's not known to the dog, and the dog is not cottoning onto it. Oh, this is a thing. So I think once the dog realizes this is the thing, it's surpassed free shaping and it's finally become into the category of shaping, which you're 100%. Like when you said we've got all these other tools that we can then implement under the umbrella of shaping, and free shaping comes under the umbrella of shaping, because once you've gotten to that part where I believe, from my observation, but once I believe that the dog knows what it's doing, now the dog has gone, oh, okay, so we're doing a behavior. You and I are doing something where we're going to trade a currency here. So when the dog is aware of the currency, and then you can see the dog going, oh, well, I'm going to repeat the behavior again. The dog is onto it. It's no longer free shaping. It's no longer something that is occurring in the wild and you are paying the dog and the dog's thinking, why did that happen? What are we doing here? Like, why did I suddenly get a marker and a reinforcer at the end of this? Like, why did that happen? It's an incredible journey. And, like I've had people where I've talked about this before that vehemently disagree with me, and that's their prerogative. They're allowed to do this. It doesn't mean that I'm entirely right in what I'm saying. But if you really think about it, free shaping, how can that be something that you have manifested under a capture point?
So I feel like this is the point where I want to sort of zig a little bit and talk about some Greek mythology because it will help people understand. Now, in the original episode that we did on this, I'm sure I told you about it. I got an interesting email afterwards. It was an email from a lady and she gave me the compliment sandwich and basically said, like the show, I'm actually from a force-free background and you're one of the balanced trainers I can tolerate. Obviously enough because it was a Patreon episode, so they're paying us, to hear what we had to say. So that was the first thing. And then it was like, you don't really understand what you're talking about in terms of shaping to luring and everything in between because you missed out on this thing, this thing, this thing. There are a bunch of different things with different acronyms I'd never heard of, but keep up the good work. You're doing a good job. So it was the compliment sandwich.
How can you not understand it if you're achieving the objectional results?
Yeah. So that's kind of where the conversation went. And we had a little bit of a back and forth. Like it was fine.
Yeah, but does that mean – hang on. I've got to talk about this. Does that mean that you don't understand her way of doing it? When people say to me, you don't understand how to do something and yet I achieve the result, then I do understand. The proof is in the pudding. Like if you tell me how to make a cake your way and I make it my way and we both get the cake there to rise and my cake tastes like your cake, well, I fucking know how to make that cake. Yeah. So, okay, let's continue.
Hang on, but let me be clear as well. This is 5 years ago and it was an email back and forth. So like I don't remember all the details. Sure. I definitely don't want to throw her under the bus. Yeah, but that was the sentiment. That's how I feel sort of on the back end of it was that it was like, hey, you missed a lot of stuff and it's important. And I don't feel like it's important because what I want to sort of explain is that we have different sects, right? Like sects that where some people are very pro shaping and that's the only way things can be done. And if you're not doing that, and I mean free shaping, if you're not doing that, then you're not training your dog. And then others are very much luring, or maybe you'll talk about people who will teach through play only, right? Like there's all these different categories of ways that people train dogs. And very often we find people sort of, putting themselves within one and saying, I'm a person that does this. But the truth is very rarely, if ever, is anybody strictly a person that trains in one particular way because exceptions come up all the time. And seldom as professionals, like of course the people exist, but seldom as professionals do we ever encounter a dog where we realize, oh, my normal way of doing things isn't having an effect on this dog. Therefore, this dog is untrainable. Usually what we end up finding from competent people, and, if we're watching them on the internet and they're causing a stir and we're seeing what they're doing, they're competent to a degree. They're achieving success. Most people will try what they know because that feels familiar and they have a system or a template or whatever that they apply to most dogs and it works. But when it doesn't, then that's when you got to sort of realign and go, this isn't necessarily working for me. And what I think, and certainly what she pointed out in her email, if I remember correctly, was pointing out exactly as what I've self-declared at the start here, is that within the literature, there are actual terms for these things, right? Like if you get into behavioral science papers, there are real terms for free shaping and there's a definition of what that is, right? Then like molding, there's a definition of what that is. And I think that what her point was, there are more subtle nuances and definitions to the way that dogs are trained and you don't understand them. And my sentiment was then and remains now, I don't give a fuck. Because the dogs end up trained, right? And so my theory on it was, and one of the examples I've been told by people is when at a time when I was saying I was doing quite a lot of free shaping, and I thought that I had a sense that I wasn't really giving the dogs any feedback beyond you're right or you're wrong, but I wasn't helping them try and figure out the situation. That to me feels like free shaping. I wasn't actually free shaping because I used boxes and marker boards and stuff like that to help channel the dog into the correct behavior, because putting a dog in the true aquarium, right, like in the Skinner box of nothing to interact with and hope that they eventually do the correct behavior, It requires a level of skill that certainly I didn't have at the time and probably don't have now, and nor like a level of time and investment into helping that dog eventually get the problem, when just a little bit of help along the way, just a little bit of channeling, or even just the way that I deliver the reinforcer can help them more quickly understand what it is that I want. And I still get to tick all those boxes of like, yes, this was a free shape behavior, created creativity in the dog. The dog feels like he was the owner of it. He invented it. He feels very operant is what we would say, where the dog thinks, I did a thing. Now I have forced you to have to pay me, right? Or put you in a position where you have to. And then you go to a variable reinforcement schedule and blah, blah, blah. So what I sort of have always resigned to is, in terms of whether I free shape or lure and all of the steps in between, I think about it a lot like Theseus's ship, right? In Greek mythology, there's Theseus. He's a demigod, he's part god, and he goes on all these adventures, and he does so. The big story in Theseus, I think, is that he goes to slay a minotaur and he takes his ship to do it. But his ship in Greek mythology became this quite important thing, and it itself was worshipped. But ships wear out, right? Like especially ancient wooden boats, the decks have to be replaced. The sails tear, the ropes wear out, all these sorts of things. So this eternal ship that will last forever because it's magic, it still wears out. And over a period of time, eventually you will have replaced every component on that ship. And then we have to look at this ship and go, is that still Theseus's ship? Now, the Theseus's ship is a thought experiment in philosophy. It's a discipline of philosophy because it is just a thought experiment. There is no answer. When 50% of the ship has been replaced with new parts and the old parts are taken off, is that still his ship? At what point is it no longer Theseus's ship if Theseus himself has never stepped foot on any of the componentry of this ship? And then if you were to get all of the worn out parts that have been replaced and put them together and build a busted ass ship, but of the original components, is that now Theseus's ship? What is the other thing? Is that Theseus's ship? Now, there's no answer to these things. They're just thought experiments. It's a fun thing to think of. But that to me is very in line with the idea of how I'll train a dog to do something. Because at what point does totally free shaping become molding or capturing? At what point does prompting become luring? And so I feel like it's detrimental to the bigger picture to get too deep into that level of understanding about the very different types and methods. Now, knowing how to do them is important. Knowing how to manipulate the situation, change your training, adhere to the system, the style, the technique that is going to best serve the dog and the ultimate outcome that we're trying to train into the dog. Having that at mind, at front of mind, I think is more important than the specifics of how it's going to be done. Knowing that, like, okay, this is what I want to achieve. And my overarching picture, the thing that guides me when I am attempting to train a dog to do anything, is that I want to help the dog as little as possible, but as much as necessary. When I'm trying to get a dog to understand something, I want to be a part of that dog's understanding as little as possible. For as much as I can, I want that dog to be experimenting with behavior itself, making choices itself, and feeling as operant and therefore as, potentially as powerful and in control of its own destiny as it possibly can, whilst still making progress towards my target behavior, whatever that is. And so my overarching sort of thought is that I never get too bogged down in terms of, am I free shaping? Am I one step away from that, 2 steps away from that, 3 steps away from that, all the way to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum where I'm luring the dog into the target behavior without too much awareness from the dog that he's just following a lure at that point. None of those are very important to me, which one I'm doing. Beyond, I want to help the dog as little as possible, but as much as necessary.
I just want to add a point in there because while you've been speaking on that, I just want to step back into the conversation there to an old saying that was presented to me when I was a younger guy, and it was a business saying, but it reflects on all parts of life, and that is, stop telling me how rocky the sea is and just bring the damn ship to shore. it really aligns with what you just said before, because I just want
nautical theme. We're sticking to nautical theme.
Yeah, we're sticking to nautical themes. Exactly. We're sailors. Ahoy. So I just wanted to make mention of a trainer that I used to know early on in my career, who I consider a very good technical trainer in retrospect. And I used to watch their presentation whenever they were doing class instruction. So I used to watch and I used to really enjoy it. But they were one of the trainers that got the most contradictory feedback from clients, in so much so that clients felt that their class was boring and lacked the practical or the pragmatic element. When we investigated that, I found it interesting because I liked the technical aspect of it. I liked what they were saying and I enjoyed it at my level. And I'm not being conceited here, but at my level, I knew a fair bit about what was going on. I enjoyed it because I thought, I'm actually learning a little bit about other concepts and other beliefs. But clients didn't enjoy that because they kind of thought this has just become a theoretical preach, like I'm being preached to, and I'm not really learning anything. I'm fading out. I came here to do something with my dog. What the client expected was the pragmatic element with some technical aspect to it as well. Like, this is why we do it, now go and do it. Whereas the trainer felt like everybody needs to know this. It's really important. There becomes a crossover where that's true to a degree, but you've got to know who your person is and why it's relevant and why it's important before you decide that that's how it's got to be. So sometimes maybe with the person that spoke to you, I don't know, I wasn't part of that conversation, but maybe with the person that spoke to you, if you're talking amongst peers and you're teaching people and it's relevant to the level of understanding that you need to convey it to, then yes, it has a degree of relevancy. And it's important because that needs to be carried on. But when you're talking to tens of thousands of dog owners out there who just think, you've lost me, you're speaking in tongues, I don't even follow the conversation anymore. I came to listen to your podcast about how to train dogs. It sounds like I'm at a high-end university lecture. I've certainly been a passenger listening to other people talking on their podcast where they want to get really into the theoretical sciences of how training works and, like a lot of the phrases that I don't care to visit and I just think are way too technical and they really jam up a conversation. And even I find myself after a period of time thinking, I want to listen to something else. This is just drying my brain out. But there's people who really appreciate that. They get into the nitty-gritty of it. It's like when you're at school, you have different casts of people. You have people that fit into an intellectual group. You have people that fit into like a sports playing group. You have people that don't really care about either, and so on and so on. So yes, it can be important, but we can get bogged down in the details. And at the end of the day, the fucking dog doesn't get trained. So that's the difficulty in those sort of situations, is because while you're arguing on the internet about how to train dogs, no one's training dogs.
That's right. I feel like I want to first of all talk about free shaping and sort of talk some pros and cons, and then talk a little bit about the ways that you can cheat in free shaping. And it's no longer free shaping at that point. It's something adjacent to free shaping, but it's probably the thing you should do if the free shaping isn't working as well as you'd like. Now we can go through a few different things, and we're going to land on luring, where we'll talk about the pros and cons of luring and sort of discuss how quickly you need to try and fade that lure, where the dog is then at a point where it's not quite sure of the behavior. And hey, presto, at that point, you're kind of going around the circle all the way back to shaping or free shaping at that point, where you're trying to have the dog figure it out. So to my understanding, and like I've sort of prefaced, there are real definitions of this. You can go and do the study, but we're going to talk about it in practical terms of things that you can actually implement and do and understand. Let's imagine it as a spectrum, and the far left or right, however you want to imagine it, you've got total free shaping, which is where you put yourself in the Skinner box. You're in there potentially. You don't need to be a part of this in any way, shape or form. You could use some sort of mechanical device. We've seen treat dispensers like a treat and train or what's it called these days? A manners minder, or the other way around. I can't remember which way it's called. And there's various brands of that available. You can see really cool versions of this. Do you remember when we were at that Scent conference, Glenn, and they showed us that lab that has like 10 odors added to it every month, and it's trained completely by that robot machine? There's zero room for human error in it. It's perfectly timed. And if he puts his nose in the right thing via a laser, that triggers the dispensing of the treat. So, like however it comes to be, the idea of the free shaping is that you are not involved. You're not prompting or giving the dog any help to figure out what it is. You are just rewarding successive approximations towards it. One of the things that I think, like, I enjoy free shaping, and shaping of a sort is what I did with my dog Remy entirely. And at the time, it was because I'd been indoctrinated into it. Like, I'd just done the Nipopo schools where it's really heavily taught the shaping part of it and the power that can come of that. And I had really enjoyed, I had a dog before him that I had done a lot of shaping with, and I'd really enjoyed doing that. And I wanted to sort of see how far I could push it. And so with Remy, for the first, at least couple of years of his life, everything was free shaped. Everything was like, okay, man, you figure it out and I'll tell you whether you're right or wrong. Now, it definitely wasn't free shaping in the most strictest sense, as we've already pointed out, for a couple of reasons. I wasn't just telling him when he was right. I was also giving him guidance about things that he shouldn't do so that I could narrow the criteria a little bit quicker. Because one of I think the sort of downfalls of truly free shaping is that depending on how much of a Skinner box you can actually create, like how many things you can take off the table just because they're absent, not because you have to tell the dog, hey, it's not that, but just because they're not there. That's quite limited to real people in real environments, right? Like, so in the lab, that's fine. And if you've got a completely dedicated training space that you manipulate and control the environment of entirely, that's cool too. You can actually do that sort of thing. But for most people, certainly me at the time training, wherever I had the opportunity to train, that just isn't the case. And so like if you're training in a park and you want to train a dog to do something, the moment you take off that leash to open the aquarium and give the dog the freedom to move around without any sort of inference from you, that dog now has a lot of fucking options, right? Like that dog has a lot of options. And of course, you shouldn't be going to that area to do something that you're not ready for. But for many of us, we don't have the opportunity. We don't have a totally sterile, clear environment. I'd argue a case like, I'm here in my purpose dog training facility right now. Even here, I don't have a perfectly sterile environment, right? Like there's a lot of shit going on. There's a lot of noises and smells and things in this environment that can influence the behavior of a dog beyond what I want to actually happen, right? So certainly my initial free shaping was not true free shaping because there were times where I would create boundaries for the dog, right? Where I would maybe free shape on leash, like a long line, because I wanted to create a boundary to the aquarium that I was in. And similarly, there were times where via the electrics, I could give feedback as to like, hey, that's not the right path. You're on the wrong path. You need to do something different. And usually for me, the only time I would like to do that is when the dog kind of does nothing. Is where I can then kind of go like, hey, nothing is not the answer. But what I saw in certain communities of people who were beginning to do a lot of this kind of stuff, because at the time I was learning it, so too were many other people, because I was one of the, certainly the first silver and gold schools here in Australia, but it was at the time where most people were learning that around the world, that Bart had just started doing the schools and really pushing the shaping. And I was a part of a community of people who were playing with it for the first time. Shaping was at the time not strictly the domain of force-free people, but that's where it mostly resided, right? Like, wouldn't you'd agree that most of the people who were pushing total free shaping were, for the most part, from the force-free community, as well as when I started really going looking for it, where I saw heaps of information and advice on how to do shaping was with exotic animals, and mostly those kept in zoos. And the training is in like protected custody style training where you cannot get into the enclosure with the animal. You are on the outside of the enclosure. And we all have probably seen, as an example of that, the video of the hyena getting a blood draw, right? Where that has to happen from behind the bars. You can't get in the containment with the hyena. So at the time, there was a lot of people doing the same thing, and I loved it. I think one of the biggest pitfalls of shaping or free shaping is how much fun it is to do. And I think that that's a very dangerous thing when training can be so fun for the trainer, but potentially quite frustrating for the learner. I think that that's a bit of a dangerous combination. Now, that's not to say that that's a fault of free shaping. That's up to the individual to not put themselves and their dog in a position where that can be the problem. But I certainly saw and experienced a decent amount of that, where I was pushing sessions way too long. Therefore, in order to be able to push sessions way too long, the only way that I could do that was to reduce my reward volume each time. So if you're training with kibble and you have 100 kibbles as a budget for the session, the trainer in me that was loving doing the sessions and didn't want them to stop started paying 1 kibble per rep, right? And you get 1 kibble worth of attitude per rep when you pay with 1 kibble per time. So I think that of the pros and cons of that free shaping style, where I kind of landed on it, I won't go through all the details of it, but where I kind of landed was that for sure, what I found that I was getting was that the dog becomes very operant and the dog has a real sense of, I am pushing you around. And I think that for some dogs, that's a really strong pro. Like that's a fantastic mindset to put the dog into. And that can really build a dog and that can make a dog feel as though it's more than some sooky little prank monkey. It's autonomous, like it can do whatever it wants and it just has to live with the consequences of its actions. When you're doing that kind of thing and you're just doing a lot of free shaping and mostly using rewards within that, the consequences of its actions are usually wonderful. And so the dog within that session feels as though it's prompting the handler and it can really strengthen and it can really empower a dog. Has that been your observation when you do any of that kind of free shaping?
Again, to draw back on what I was talking about before, and I'll use my time with Macho when I was raising and training him. When he was a little puppy, he was living inside. He was in a crate. So in the mornings, I'd go and get him out, or Narelle would get him out first thing in the morning and let him toilet and let him relieve himself. And one morning we had one of those hard plastic Bosu ball type of things in the room. I happened to be with him. It was on the ground. It wasn't planned. It wasn't intentional. And he walked over to it and he put his paw on it. And I happened to have a marker and food in my pocket. So I marked him and treated him at the time. Right when that happened, to reflect on my concept of what I believe free shaping to be, I believe those first couple of reps that he did with that was free shaping because he didn't realize I'm going to get rewarded for this. It's going to turn into something. But he did it and I marked him and he looked up at me in surprise and he went, oh, I'm getting a treat. So he ran over and he got rewarded. And then he didn't think anything of it again. He just went out to the toilet. He didn't go back to it because at that point in time, he wasn't aware that this is a thing. It wasn't contrived from that point in time. It wasn't locked in as a behavior. So he went to the toilet, brought him back, and I thought, I wonder what we'll do if we stand in the room long enough and he's a little bit bored. We walked in the room. He didn't immediately go back to the Bosu ball. He walked around a little bit, and then he walked over to it and he looked at it and booped it with his nose. He didn't actually touch it with his paw, but he booped it with his nose. I marked him and reinforced him. The minute I did that on the second rep, you could see like his neurons connecting. He then went, oh, this is a thing. This is what you want me to do. Then he kept going back and repeating the behavior, and I got him in a lock-in sort of momentum where he went back and forth, and we got him on a continuous schedule where he was doing the same thing over and over again on a repeat pattern. So as you do, like you finish strong and you don't make the intensity too much or devalue the lesson by making it too extreme or beyond the dog's comprehension. I just picked it up and put it away after I gave him a jackpot. Once that happened, every morning I'd bring him out. Then he was looking for the Bosu ball. He knew that the behavior was something that was going to get him paid. Like he'd see it on top of the fridge and he'd run to the fridge and start standing on his back legs saying, get that down for me so we can do the thing. So once I get my dogs to that, that's when I believe, that's when I feel it in my heart through my observation and my understanding of a dog training that I've surpassed something that was organic, free in the wild, that the dog just did, and I paid the dog for it, and the dog thought, what was all that about? And then we got a lock-in. We got a contractual behavior between me and the dog where he went, now I want to do this. And that's when we started to go through those continuous schedules into an intermittent schedule, back into a continuous schedule when we had strength in that new correspondence of behavior and ebb and flow backwards and forwards between there. By the end of it, the skill that I taught him to do when he was 8 weeks old when we were doing that, by the time he was 16 weeks of age, so 4 weeks later, I got him on cue where I could say balance and he'd step up on it and he'd perfectly balance it. So he'd hold it in a perfect balance, all 4 feet on it. Instead of it rocking backwards and forwards, he'd hold it in a perfect balance. So that was the behavior that I taught him to do as a young pup. I filmed it and I put, like it's on my social media if anyone cares to see it. But I filmed the end result so I could say to him, balance, and he'd hop on and he'd balance on it. Nothing incredibly complex. Like it didn't really involve any sort of chaining behaviors where we had to include something else, that the dog had to do something. It wasn't like he had to pick something else up and then do the balancing process. So nothing incredibly complex. But nonetheless, I thought, well, here we go. For a little puppy, I'm going to start teaching him how to do something that he's shown interest in. And I've never taught a dog to do this, so it's going to be a learning experience for me nonetheless. That's when I consider, all right, so where is your mind? Where's your head at when we're doing this? Like, what are you thinking about? And those initial responses, he wasn't thinking about it. He wasn't on the hook then. He didn't actually think, oh, this is a thing. He just went, oh, I got food. Don't know why that happened. I'll take it. Sure, why not? I'll get paid. And we walked out. He went for a piss. Like I said, to repeat myself on what we were talking about before, the hook happened when there was a couple of reps into it. I think it was about the third or fourth rep that actually happened. And he went, this is a thing. That's why I'm saying at that point, that's when I consider I'm no longer free shaping, I'm shaping. We're in an agreement now where you are stimulated by the presence of the object. So you know this is a setup now, like this is something that we're actually doing. Let's say, for example, I took your wife, Jane, she's an artist. Like let's say, for example, I took her into an art class and there was a vase in the middle of the room. She would know that the object is to sketch that vase. Whereas if I brought her into
context tells her what to do.
Yeah, but if I gave her a pen and paper and just said, just draw anything, whatever comes to mind, then she is freely drawing into her imagination like, oh, what could I draw? Where I just said, create something that you don't normally do, just something abstract, completely off the card. Like she's freely designed something. She's reaching into the depths of her imagination and coming up with something. So like she knows she's drawing and she knows she's going to do all those sort of things, but it's not contrived. She's not on the hook of doing something. There's no model in place for her to go, oh, I'm sketching a vase. That's what I'm doing today. And that's kind of the way that I look at it whenever I'm setting somebody up or I'm explaining the pathway to a student on what it is. I really feel also that people get overly fixated on free shaping, and that's why they use it out of context. Like they make it a thing and it's too big a thing and it starts dominating the conversation and then people start fighting over it. So for sure, if you think it's a thing and you want to use it, I'm not going to fight with you anymore because I just don't have the steam left in my sails to do it. If it's important for you to call it free shaping and that's what you've been brought up on and that's what your mentor says and you believe everything that your mentor tells you, good for you. Great, wonderful.
Yeah, I think what sort of entered the language, and it's kind of how we should use it because it's how people are using it mostly, is that the idea of free shaping something, like most people would observe the way that you explained that with Mando and put that into the category of having been free shaped, because at no point were you trying to get him onto it. You're just letting him do whatever he wanted. By at the start, it was an accident, right? And so, what we'd say is most operancy comes from spontaneous behavior. Something just happens and there's an outcome, right? And so, but at no point were you encouraging him onto the ball.
Yeah, it wasn't contrived.
It was just that he felt like, and that's sort of, I think, the crux of the benefits that come of it is that something happened by accident and he was reinforced. And then he thought, oh, that's interesting. Let me just muck around with this thing again, see what happens. And then he's reinforced again. And then you use that where you then, as the big brain in the situation, right? I think that's one of the things of like shaping is where we're looking at the dog and we go, okay, like I'm so much smarter here. You don't necessarily need to even know the increments I'm working towards. You'll do them in and of yourself through frustration because I won't reinforce the thing that you have done in the past that caused reinforcement, and that will prompt a little bit more action. That'll prompt a little bit, try a little bit harder. That'll prompt just a little bit more so that you can ultimately reinforce.
One of the interesting things too, and I've only caught it by chance on a couple of occasions just because of the frequency of dogs that I've been able to do it with. If you're close enough to a dog when that happens, you can actually see their pupils dilate. They open right up and they go, oh, because it's the true aha moment. When the light bulb truly comes on in their brain, everything connects at that point. Like they've got a convergence in their head where the neuron clusters actually reach out. If you watch neurons under a microscope when they actually find each other, they're like little fingers on the end of stalks.
Yeah.
They're calling to each other and then they grab hold of each other and then the circuitry is formed. But you can see it because the fucking eyes, like they just go like that and they come up like saucepans. And I saw Macho do that on one of the occasions where we were free shaping a behavior and he just went, oh, I get it. Humans do it too. We do that for different things, but certainly when we get that big rush of dopamine, when we go, oh my God, I know, I feel it. I understand what it is. And you get excited about it because you think I'm in control here. Like I can actually make that happen.
And I think that like depending on the reinforcer, type and volume and nature, sometimes those sort of early jackpots in a shaping type scenario can have massive effect, like far more reaching than you would think. There's a funny meme that I wish I'd screenshot when I saw it. It was a picture of a lab, and it was looking under this tree, and it said that one time they went to this particular park and the dog found a sandwich under that tree. And every day for the next 8 years, the moment he gets to that park, runs over and checks under that tree for that sandwich. And I think while that's funny, that is a pretty good insight into the way that shaping can work. Nobody told the dog to do it. He just did his own thing, was walking around and received a massive payment for spontaneous behavior and low cost spontaneous behavior, right? So like that dog is alive. He's walking around. He goes to that place every day. So when we talk low cost, it's not like it was something that the dog had to, do a particular sequence of events, or it burns a lot of calories to do what he was doing. Because I think that's one of the things that we as trainers sort of seldom think about as well, like the cost of a behavior to the learner. Like some behaviors are very costly. You can only pull them off once or twice, and so you tend not to do those sorts of things. And like as an example of that, a chin up is one to think of. Like that's a very costly behavior for a person to do.
Yep.
Like if you have to climb onto something, very often you're only going to be able to do that once every 10 minutes or so, right? Like you're going to have the recovery time of having climbed onto that. So that's a high cost behavior. In order to get onto there, that like you'd want to fucking need to get up there if you're going to do the chin up or the muscle up, even more so, to climb onto a roof. I've only got one of those in me a day. I'd want to make sure I'm getting up there at the right time. But low cost behaviors, like just going and checking under a tree whether there's a sandwich there when you are free at any time anyway, is something that can become very permanently ingrained with an early jackpot into the thing. We observe that. We do that all the time in training. We, like you might set up a scenario to try and get something done. The dog just happens to fluke get it right on the first rep. You're crazy if you're expecting to have to approximate towards something, and if the dog by accident flukes it perfectly on the first rep, you're crazy if you don't jackpot in that moment. Like you're crazy if you don't dump the whole treat pouch and go, that's it, congratulations, and then not do another rep for another couple of days and then put the dog in the same position and see what happens. It's much more likely that you're going to get the same thing versus if you just like give him a minor reinforcer approximating towards it. I want to talk on, so now we've been back and forth. I think that we've more clearly defined what we mean when we're talking about free shaping, and that we're not talking the true essence of free shaping as you have just described. We're talking about the idea of not interfering with the dog very much, like minimally being involved with the dog, is certainly not prompting it, certainly not luring it, certainly not trying to guide it into the behavior, but potentially creating a circumstance where that seems like the behavior that the dog should do. Whether that means that we've set up the environment to allow for it, or we've opened the window of a session and we've let the dog see us clearly put the thing in the environment, as would have been the case, as you said, you had that Bozu ball stored on top of something where he couldn't get to it. Certainly, there's an argument to be made that just getting that down from where it was is a huge cue to the dog that now this is available and that the session has begun, or the opportunity to earn for having touched this thing has begun. So we're no longer truly free shaping, but we're doing what most people would refer to as free shaping, in that we're not trying to help the dog understand it. We're just incrementally rewarding as the dog makes progress towards it. I think that kind of training is so powerful for building the brain and personality of a dog. I think that held so much value in doing that with silly bullshit behaviors, exactly as you just described as what you did with Mando. You don't like
Macho,
for sure.
Macho, the shepherd.
Macho. So health and fitness wise, like, yeah, for sure, him being able to balance on a Bozu ball is going to help with core and blah, blah, blah. There's benefits to that. But mostly teaching, what you said, he started at 10 weeks old or something like that, or 8 weeks.
Yep.
Teaching that to a puppy is just a bullshit behavior that is an opportunity to teach that puppy about what it is to be operant, right? And to build more of his personality rather than anything else. And you're teaching him how to learn in increments, teaching him how to experiment with his environment. I think one of the greatest benefits that I see come from that style of training is, especially with sort of sketchy, fearful dogs who might not want to go towards something. Like, the classic example I tend to use when we talk about this is like a grate. There's so many dogs that are afraid of grates on the ground to the point where they go around them or won't go past them. And sometimes there's no way to avoid that. We have to go over this grate, and then you're kind of stuck in this position with that dog. That's the thing to shape it towards. In my opinion, that's the ultimate use of that kind of shaping, is where you just say to a dog, hey man, do whatever you want. And every time you take a step towards that thing, I'm going to pay you. And if you walk away from it, that's fine. I'm not going to do anything. You can just not be near it, but we're both going to have a very boring time here. But if you so much as look at it, I'm going to reinforce that. And anything that even looks slightly like a step towards being more comfortable with that grate is going to be reinforced. And in every instance when I've done this, you end up with a dog that chooses to lay on the grate given the opportunity, because it realigns the value. And I think one of the beauties of doing this kind of training with a dog is that you seldom ever can go over threshold. Now, when we're trying to, lure a dog towards a grate, right? Let's stick with that same example. We've got a dog that's scared of it. One of the things that people want to do is lure towards that. And the worst thing that can possibly happen is if you're luring the dog towards that and it disengages from the lure. Because now you've just taught that dog, the grate is scary, and you should give up on high value things if they get too close to the grate, right? And it's inevitable. You're going to do that. Like, as humans, we make mistakes. I don't care how good you are. At some point, you put a dog slightly over threshold because you sort of think they're capable of more than they are. I do that to myself all the time. I put myself over the threshold, right? Like, you sort of take bigger risks than you should.
Yes, Captain Kettleball.
Yeah, exactly, right? But with a dog that you're trying to convince to approximate itself towards something that it doesn't want to go towards or wouldn't choose otherwise to go towards, it's not going to put itself over threshold. And so while this training can take a little while, right, it's not necessarily my first choice of things to do. There's a lot of depends as to whether I'm going to do this. But it works fucking great. In every instance I've done it, you end up with a dog that chooses that space because that space now has value and everything else doesn't necessarily.
It's an interesting concept when you're talking about this. Like, if you listen to any podcast where they start to talk about therapy in any retrospect, ultimately, and these are people who are delivering therapy. These are not just people who conceptualize it and just sit down in a room and start thinking about, let's talk about a topic that's beyond us. These are people who are
like
esteemed.
us, what we do.
Yeah. These are people who are esteemed psychologists, psychiatrists, and the like, people who are dealing with mental health on a regular basis. Like, you listen to them long enough, and they primarily suggest that it's you that comes up with your relief. I'm sitting in the room and I'm suggesting things to you, but I'm telling you about the door that you've got to go through. You're the one in your mind that's got to reach for the handle, open it, and go through the mind. Yes, you feel better because I'm there and I'm helping you out with it, but I'm not pushing you. I'm not taking you up to a physical door and making you touch it when you're afraid of doors. I'm waiting for you to be comfortable enough to have the fortitude and the strength to be able to manifest that courage or even that desensitization effect or counter conditioning, whatever you're using, to primarily go, I'm ready to do it today. I'm sitting with a friend, I'm sitting with a colleague, someone, no one's ever believed in me in my life. And that's why I felt so shit about this behavior. But I'm sitting with somebody who's saying to me, it's okay. I'm here with you. I'm going to stand beside you and I'm going to watch you do it.
But it's up to you.
But it's up to you. You can act whenever you want. And you're 100% right. Like, if I made you go to that door and you had a bad experience and you turn around and go, well, you're a fucking liar. Yeah. There you go. You made me go to a door when I was telling you I was uncomfortable with it, and something awful, like I burnt myself on the handle or I got electric shock on it or whatever it was. I know we're talking metaphorically here, but it's still the recovery process that we work with dogs. And I agree with you. I've given up on trying to lure. I did in the start because I became very impatient about it, and I wanted to see immediate results and show clients that things could be done quickly and try and impress people, but it's the wrong way to do things. You only get those results when you're ready to, and I explain it to people through aggression, I explain it to people through phobia, fear-related behaviors and so forth. Like, this dog has got to be ready to cross over this threshold. It happens when the dog is ready. The student has to set the speed and the duration of how far we're going to go into this lesson. And if they're not ready for it, they're not ready for it, and they're in the lesson. I just want to add just one point there to talk about the concept of jackpotting, because we brought that up. And it was a concept that Michael Ellis was talking about at the seminar, that one of the seminars when he was here. And I've heard it before, but I'm pretty sure I heard it through Michael. And I think from memory that Michael credits it to Bob Bailey, where our old belief of jackpotting was just to give one gigantic handful of food, Whereas science has actually measured now that jackpots truly come in, like it's basically a 1, 2, 3, 4 delivery.
Left hand, right hand, left hand,
yes,
right hand.
left hand, right hand. Exactly. So it's instead of like a massive hand of kibbles, it's like 10 handouts of the reinforcement. So the dog can think, oh yeah, I'm counting out like a bigger duration. And if you look at the capuchin monkey trial where they were feeding grapes and cucumber, like they know equity. They know when they're getting robbed of something. They know when something's better value. So we can't now just conclude that animals are stupid and they don't know and they can't count and they can't see those type of things. It's been proven scientifically that they rage out when one gets a grape and this is the capuchin monkey thing that I'm talking about, when one got a grape and the other one got cucumber, it went, no, this is inequity of pay here. I don't like what's actually going on. So we've got to concede that those sort of things are very important to our dogs as well. Like they understand this. Whereas if they just get a handful of food, they go, oh, okay, that's one feed. Where now I've got 5 or 10, or I don't know, it's a random amount, but nonetheless, it's still a bigger amount than what I got before. So I can actually see that I'm getting a process here.
Yeah. I think one thing I do want to just mention is like, we just talked about like that instance of say going to a grate and how the best way to do that appetitively, like using just nothing but positive reinforcement, is usually shaping the dog towards it and how luring them towards it. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. I think most notably is they disengage from the lure. The other thing that, people will have seen quite a lot is that if you get enough high volume or high value reinforcer, say you get food that the dog really can't resist, what we see a lot, and this is as detrimental, is that the dog will overcome its fear in order to get that food. But food is such an impermanent thing. So the dog is like put itself into what it considers a very dangerous situation because there's a higher value thing in that situation. But then it eats that food and it's still in that situation. And then you get that dog will like run out of that or freak out or have an eruption or whatever. So like that's one of the main reasons why I like to use shaping when I'm using a positive reinforcement approach to that. I feel obliged to say though, there's plenty of other techniques. Like sometimes, depending on the dog, depending on the situation, I will just model strength and use some negative reinforcement to bring dogs towards things that they're afraid of, right? Like especially with young, ignorant kind of dogs that are like, oh no, that's peculiar and weird. I don't want people to think that I strictly would only use free shaping to get a dog to go towards that thing. Oftentimes I'll walk the dog around on the leash and show the dog about leash pressure and then just walk straight up to the thing with confidence, especially when it's something that I know for sure cannot actually hurt the dog and the dog has never had a bad experience with it. It's just assigned a negative value to that at first glance.
Yep.
Those kind of situations, you can spend weeks trying to fix that via shaping and actually just draw attention to the problem. And like you will fix it, but it's going to get much worse before it is fixed. But often in those circumstances, you can go, hey, fuck you, we're doing this. And the problem vanishes in an instant. And, you would have seen a million times where you do that kind of thing to a dog and then the dog is almost sheepish. Like, I was worried about that. Like, why was I concerned, right? Like, because they can get over it instantly and it's never a problem again.
Great explanation. And to fit a pragmatic example to that, I was watching a group of people, and this was probably about 2 decades ago. So it was a long time ago. I was watching a group of people trying to shape a dog into going through a tunnel. The dog wanted nothing to do with it. And they were doing the same sort of thing. They were trying to successively approximate the dog to the tunnel. And that worked to a degree. But 10 weeks later, that dog still would not go to the tunnel. And I was sitting there in the distance watching what was going on. And nobody asked me for my advice or my input at any other time until that 10th week. Somebody walked up to me and said, what would you do, Glenn? And I said, do you want me to show you or do you want theory? And they said, no, look, this is going on far too long and we just can't get the dog to do this. I said, everything that you've been doing is correct. I asked the question, has this dog had a bad experience with tunnels before? Like, has something gone wrong? Has he been dragged into it and something's gone really awry and what's going on? They said, no, nothing has happened. Never experienced a tunnel, just won't go anywhere near it. And I said, cool. All right, let's cantilever the tunnel. I said, I know you've done that at one part of the experiment anyway. Let's cantilever it right up, put some octopus straps around it. The dog was on a flat collar. I said, you grab the end of the lead. I'm going to hold the dog by the rear. And we just did a hardcore negative reinforcement program. They kept pressure on the lead. 2 people made sure that the tunnel wasn't going to move. It wasn't going to fall or wasn't going to, get stuck on the dog or anything like that. Walked the dog straight up to it. The dog was visibly scared of what was going on. However, the dog ran through it and got over it straight away. And we repeated that about half a dozen times. By the 6th time that we actually did this, the pressure on the leash was actually minimal. The dog just walked up to it and goes, I know I'm going to go through this, so let's just get it over and done with. 3 weeks later, we had the tunnel on the field. The dog ran over to it. They put him in a sit in front of it and said, go through, and the dog volunteered to run through the tunnel. And the problem was, see, we just got the dog over a hurdle that it created this monstrosity in its head that this is a big thing, something I need to be afraid of. And if we allowed that manifestation to just carry over the entire time, like, I don't know if they put another 10 weeks of trying to approximate the dog into the tunnel, whether he'd go through it or not, but it didn't look like he was going to budge. In fact, what I could see is the dog just thought that tunnel is making a problem for me. All of these people are making an issue of this thing, and now it's starting to make me anxious about going near the tunnel. I don't actually feel comfortable. Whereas what I did is I removed the anxiety. Yeah, pretty much. People might argue and say that's very intense and things could go wrong. Granted, they could. But I took away all of the anomalies of things that could go wrong. Like, I was watching it for 10 weeks and I kept playing it out in my head. This is what I would do. So I made sure the tunnel is cantilevered. So that problem was gone. There was 2 people on either side of the tunnel. So it couldn't snag on the dog and the dog couldn't run off and get freaked out by the tunnel dragging along with it. That was taken care of. I had a competent person who was handling the dog on the other edge that knew exactly my game plan and how to reward the dog clear of the tunnel once the dog got through. So that was taken care of. Everything had a process that was taken care of because we mitigated every single fact into realizing, yeah, the dog's scared of this, but he has no experience in it. So why should he be scared of it? Like, he has anxiety about this. He doesn't have experience with this. He has no experience. He has a belief of something that hasn't manifested. He's just conjured up some imaginary concept of this is a bad thing and I should avoid it at all costs. Whereas what we taught him, as I said, in 3 weeks' time, what we taught him was, oh, this is actually a good thing. Not only do I feel relief when I go through it, but it gives me access. It opens doorways to me on the other side, and I get to do a whole bunch of great things. So again, we pre-mapped that tunnel into a lot of things. We taught the dog, I know that there's a thing that you want to do on the other edge of this, but you have to do the tunnel first. The tunnel is the access portal to that other behavior, the thing that you want to do. And the dog goes, fuck yeah, I'm doing it.
I think that the power of overcoming anxiety and the relief of fear to act as a reinforcer is not very well understood, but it is absolutely observed.
Yep.
Like, if you've ever waited in line for a roller coaster, it is always the people who are most afraid of going on the roller coaster afterwards are the ones that want to do it again straight away, because the feeling of having gotten through it is so truly reinforcing. And I mean that in the like scientific sense of the term, in that it increases the frequency and likelihood of the behavior, right? So like, it's going to make the person want to do it again. Whereas the person who's kind of ho-hum about the roller coaster is not concerned about it, gets off and goes, yep, I did that. Next. Like, what's the next thing? Whereas usually, and it's certainly observable, the people who are freaking out about it, when they're done, they're like, oh my God, that was amazing. I want to do it again. And that's what we're essentially able to sometimes create via that system. But what I think is interesting is, like, for the most part, when we think of, and certainly it's how we defined it, is that when we talk about that free shaping, we usually sort of think of it in terms of just positive reinforcement, but we're getting the exact same benefits from doing it with negative reinforcement in the way that you just described, right? So like, it's not the same thing, but we're getting the same benefit in that the dog was like, well, this is what I have to do. Like, it's my choice. I'm going to do it. And I feel this relief of stress. Like, of course, like with that negative reinforcement approach, the dog has the option of just not doing it, like giving a full refusal. And then you're in a position, if you're using negative reinforcement, of like, fuck, how do I solve this? Because negative reinforcement has to be escalatable. Like, it has to get to the point. But like most trainers, like, I very seldom, but there've been times where I'm like, oh shit, I don't think it's going to work. And I don't want to up the pressure because now I'm going to risk shutting the dog down or creating some form of helplessness. So like, we're creating the same mental state from the dog of like, you chose to do this, you had the amazing outcome, you will want to do it again. And I think that to sort of round out the pros of minimally helping with the dog, those are them. That's the thing. But as we sort of pointed out, when you are hands off as much as possible, in order to have the dog make the next step. Now, no matter what behavior it is that you're teaching, let's stick with your example of getting onto a bozo ball, right? Like, that serves the function. You said he initially was bopping it with his nose, and then eventually, let's say he puts one paw on it and you reinforce. In order to get the second paw on there, you're waiting for some sort of extinction burst to happen, right? That's where he goes, hey, this has worked in the past. It's no longer working, so I'll try harder at this. And perhaps in that example, may be recognizable by us. He might try the same behavior harder by pushing it more or like putting more of his weight onto that leg. That's not what we want. You could potentially reinforce that, but you're waiting for him to make a major movement of putting the other paw onto it. And that's what gets reinforced. But in doing that, we are without a doubt having to tap into frustration, because frustration is what's going to prompt the next thing, right? Like that's what's going to bring on the next bit of the behavior. And there's risks in doing that. You can get frustration related behaviors. You might get a bark. You might just have the mindset carry into there. We often see dogs that are very free shaped, and I absolutely observe this of my own, like huffs. He like with his nose at certain behaviors because they were frustration-related behaviors that accompanied the next step that I wanted. And it can be very tricky as a trainer to decide, oh shit, the dog did exactly what I wanted him to do. He has taken the next step, but at the same time, he has done something I don't want to reinforce. And now you can find yourself in a really tricky position of being like, shit, what do I do now? You know, that's up to you in the moment. You have to choose the lesser of two evils and decide that for yourself. But that's the biggest risk that I see in that kind of training, is that you are potentially risking frustration or extinction related behaviors or events, we could say, sneaking into the chain that you're creating. And maybe they are conditioned into it. Like you might have the dog do the behavior, but do it in frustration for the rest of his life because that's what gets conditioned. Or you might end up with a bark or a sniff or anything. You know, you can end up with peculiar things that we end up putting into the category of a superstitious behavior because the dog did it and got reinforced. So he's like, well, that must be part of it. And he'll continue to do it within that sequence of events forever, or until you somehow figure out how to communicate to the dog like that bit's not required in order to actually attain reinforcement, which there's plenty of ways to do, but none of them are fucking easy, especially in complex behaviors that you have taught without your interference, because the moment you interfere, that's a new signal that's going to change the behavior of the dog and it may not continue with the rest of the chain of events.
Well, see, that part of the conversation which you seeded in there, that's how I would diagnose the difference between a good trainer and a great trainer. A good trainer will take the fast track and they will tempt the superstitious behavior coming in because they kind of see it like, this is my chance. It's my opportunity to excel forward. Whereas a great trainer would probably say, no, I won't risk that. What I'll do is I'll wait for the dog because I know I'm good enough to allow the dog to manifest into this behavior anyway. So it might take me an extra 2 weeks to do it, but I know I'm going to get there and I'm not going to sacrifice having the dog think, well, what behavior was it? And then beyond that balance ball itself of going, yeah, I did this and I did that. So which one was it? When you create that fork in the road, that can be very hard to eliminate down the track because then the dog can play with that because then it gets excited by it and thinks, well, something different happened and it was a little risque and daring. I know dogs aren't as analytical as human beings are, but they can get fucked up and fixated on the wrong type of thing because it's like scent detection trainers when they don't clean their properties enough and when they're in their preliminary phases of teaching a dog how to do something, the dog goes, oh, well, I'm not really sure which scent it is yet because there's 2 scents and one is more appetitive to me. And you're thinking, well, why the fuck do you keep going after that odor? And that's not the odor I want to teach. Or why do you keep doing that behavior? That's not the behavior I wanted to teach. So for me, these days, I won't make that sacrifice anymore. I won't think to myself, well, I'm just going to fast track this and just hope that it works out in my favor. I'll just wait. I'll just let the dog frustrate back and teach the dog, just go back to where we were. Let's stick to the lesson plan. I know sometimes I bore people to death talk about guitaring because it's not a guitaring show, but this is how I learn how dogs are learning when I'm doing things myself. And I'm like, I try to exceed my capability because I think I want to be better than what I am. I don't want to be stuck at this level, but it never plays out well for me when I do that because what happens is instead of staying with the lesson, I put the guitar down and I finish it because I become so ultimately frustrated. And that's not what I want to do. I'm remarkably better now than what I was when I first started doing it. But even though I'm better, I'm still not great. I'm still an amateur in it, but I'm remarkably better than where I was because I've looked back at my journey and I've incrementally allowed myself to carry through by shaping and chaining myself into certain different criteria. You know, there's so many disciplines you've got to learn. And it's the same thing we're doing when we're trying to build this storyboard of what we're trying to teach the dog on how to achieve the ultimate end goal of what this behavior actually is. And as we know, It depends on how complex the behavior is. But these things, there are criteria to certain things where you go, all right, we're teaching this one today, so this is one leg of it. And then we're going to put that on the shelf for a moment because I need to teach you a new criteria. Or we might be doing 2 criteria simultaneously, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, because that's part of how we're going to chain these 2 criteria together. And we're thinking, well, I've got to teach you section A independently and section B independently, so you don't become confused about them or concerned. And then when you're ready to chain them together, it just becomes one behavior. And then the dog is not obsessed by thinking, oh, this is A and B. It just thinks of, this is the path. These were 2 tunnels, but now it's just one tunnel, and I just run through the tunnel. That's what I do, metaphorically speaking.
You said something super interesting then about when you get too frustrated, you put the guitar down. That's very interesting. Frustration isn't like we've sort of danced around that as being a bad thing.
No, I'm always frustrated when I'm playing. Every time I pick the guitar up, it starts with frustration. But it's a enjoyable level or it's a unbearable level. Like when it becomes unbearable and I feel like I'm a fuckwit, I can just feel like nothing's making sense here and it's getting worse and I can actually see things unraveling. That's when I put it down because I'm doing damage then. I'm not actually building anything. I'm destroying something.
That's exactly it. So I think that frustration is never something to like avoid entirely. It's absolutely necessary in order to promote growth because you don't grow without frustration. Like I think that we observe this, a small amount of frustration prompts action. It can trigger creativity. It can create new pathways because you're like, hey, this isn't working for me. I need something more. Like you only have to hold the salt shaker a little bit longer before frustration becomes aggression, right?
Yeah.
And that can be good too. There's a little taste of that into some behaviors when we're training a dog can be awesome. Like I will often frustrate a dog to the point where, especially once a dog really knows a behavior, I want to frustrate it a little bit to the point where it's like, let me fucking do it, right? And then I'm like, oh, that's the attitude I want to see. Like that's a level of commitment. But the next step after that is turning around and pointing at me and saying, if you don't let me do it or else, right? And now that's where I never want to go with it. And so frustration is never something to avoid completely, but it's something to be like acutely aware of and manage. Like for sure, that is one of the things that I really am looking to want to identify in a dog at any one point in a session and go like, what's your level of frustration at? Like, how are you doing here? Because that sort of prompts me to talk about the next thing. We won't go all the way into it because through talking about shaping and its pitfalls, we've sort of explained the cons that come of shaping are alleviated by the pros that come of luring. And as I said, there's all these steps in between, but we never adhere strictly to one or the other. We're always looking to help the dog as much as necessary, but as little as possible. But what I absolutely found is that precise, unnatural behaviors require precise guidance in order to protect the mindset and attitude into those behaviors. So for sure, using nothing but free shaping in the way that we've defined it, you can create some fucking precise behaviors from dogs. But if you want the monkey drills, like sit down, stand, healing and that kind of stuff to be super precise and super pretty, you can eventually free shape a dog to be able to do those things. But you are opening up a huge amount of risk that the attitude with which the dog does those things is going to be in that state of frustration / aggression, which at times can be fucking awesome, but has those big risks of carrying those frustration related behaviors, the barking, the sniffing or huffing in the behavior, or even just the level of stress that the dog carries in itself in that behavior. And we know that stress is accumulative, right? So like if you're taking that dog into battle, the battle is fucking stressful enough. You don't need any more stress on the approach to it. I don't want my dog stressed in the heel anymore. There was a time when I wanted that. I don't want that at all anymore. What I want as my dog is healing is total free and looseness because we're going to heal into fucking battle. I don't need you simmering at a level of stress prior to that because we're accumulating that shit. And eventually it gets to a point where it's not helpful to me. So why start off the bottom if I can avoid that? So I think that's the function of helping the dog. When I say help the dog as much as necessary, but as little as possible, the times when I'm intervening is when I'm like, hey man, I need you to do it in this very specific way, or I need you to do it today. right? I don't have time for you to figure this out slowly and decide that it's your own invention and that you're gonna do it. I need to help you understand this because we're on a timeline and you have to get it today, or because I need you to feel totally free and loose in this behavior. So I'm going to avoid you having to experience much frustration in the learning phase so that any frustration you feel is about what's next, not what you're doing presently.
That's a great explanation. And I just wanted to track back into that conversation before when I was talking about the tunnel, because it relates to what you're talking about there. There have been times in similar situations where myself or other trainers have received criticism over those type of choices where we've thought to ourselves, no, I'm going to do this is going to happen today. And people have said, if only you waited this out. My response to them now is, why would I castrate myself when I know that I'm competent enough to do this and I have a competent enough handling team around me and I'm going to get my dog through this? Yeah. I know the capability. I've seen this enough times. I've done the reps in this work myself. Like I've seen it play out. I've seen it play out your way multiple times, and I've seen basically people have just given up on the behavior. To use the guitar reference before, this is why people put their guitar down and never pick it up again, is because they get themselves to a point where they're so sickly frustrated by it. Their narrative in their head is, I'm fucking hopeless. I'm terrible. I'm so bad at this. I suck. And they start going through this real negative phrasing narrative in their head. And the same thing happens to a dog. I don't like this. I don't feel comfortable in this. Even though it's never been explained to me or I have no experience in it, it's just better to avoid it. It's better to stay away from it and keep away from it. Where if you've got a competent enough handling team, and we were the right team at the time to fast track that dog through the behavior, the dog totally got over it. There haven't been any real times where I've seen that done right, where it's gone badly and the dog's had a bad effect to it. Only the times where it does have a cataclysmic effect is when you've got an incompetent team trying to do it. You've got an incompetent handler, an incompetent trainer, and you've got a dog that's not ready for it. And there has been experience with those sort of things before, and it's all gone wrong. Everything is... all the beliefs that the dog had, all the visions the dog has come true. The predictions that the dog has had around the behavior, it came through because of the incompetency of the team actually doing it. So these days, people advise, and they're welcome to. People will always do that. You have your critics in everything you do. You need to be competent or confident in yourself that when you know that this is the best thing to do, and this is the way to help your student overcome this issue, this is the way to actually advocate for them properly. And we are talking about advocacy in their mental health and their behavior. This is the time to step it up and say, thanks for your opinion, but in this case, you're wrong. Sit down and watch. This wasn't happening enough in the past. We sort of got hardballed into a position where people felt like, oh no, I better sit back here because I'm going to be perceived as being something. Whereas real advocacy and real results needed people like that to step up and saying, no, I'm going to help this student overcome this. So instead of this being now 20 weeks into trying the behavior or just giving it up on completely because nobody wants to address the problem here, 3 weeks into it, we can address it. Now the dog is through the behavior and it's on the other side of it, and it's never thought of again. There's not even any residual. The dog never revisits that because the dog thinks, I have the confidence to do this. My brain even is programmed now to resolve this issue. It isn't an issue. It is no longer an issue because you have therapeutically advanced me through this. It's not about fast tracking. It's about what's necessary.
My shtick at the moment is that there's so much info, there's so much info out there about dog training. And what I want to sort of talk about a lot at the moment, so I'm teaching these pros and cons seminars again. And in my new course, there's a whole section on this. Learn it all and use what works for you.
Yep.
And there's never a right or wrong. It's just, varied degrees of how things are going to work. And the way that me personally would train my dog to do something, and the very best way, the objectively best way, and I couldn't possibly do it any better, that might be a completely different way that you and your dog train to do something.
100%.
And then if we swap dogs, now we've got a whole new dynamic. So maybe my way isn't the best. So like there is no right or wrong. There's just varied degrees of accuracy and success. And different people with different dogs will find that accuracy and success in different ways. And so I want to be very, very clear that if you've been listening to me sort of say, oh, you can get all these things that go wrong with shaping, it doesn't have to. You get a really super skilled person and a dog that enjoys it and is on the path. Maybe none of those things go wrong. And there's plenty of things that we can, go into with luring. And there's plenty of things that I know tons of people whose dogs never have a fucking clue what the behavior is. They just follow the lure into the behavior because they've been lured the entire time. But then I also know tons of people whose dogs were lured entirely and are now so committed to behaviors that come hell or high water, they're not breaking out of that behavior and they don't need anything that even resembles the lure. They just have a verbal command to do it.
Let me just insert the word competency in there because things will always go wrong. What matters is that you've got the competent person that has, I'm going to overuse that word, fortitude, that they understand what happens next. Like they have an array of knowledge and experience and tools available to them to say, yep, okay, something's gone wrong. I know what to do next. I know how to realign and get back on track what we're actually doing. You said before those 3 magic words that I really love and I think is part of a necessary story for everything you're doing. Use what works. And also to add something to that and do what's right. Do what's necessary. Use what works, but do what's right. I've seen people who are fucking skillful masters being benched by people who are their inferior because they're afraid of the social media narrative or something like that by somebody who's just a squawker. They're not using what works. They're not doing what's right. They're trying to tee off with a popular fucking concept, which I don't even know why some of these things have become popular. It's not necessary. It's not right. And it's not truly advocating on the dog. It's teaching dogs that if I'm so scared of something, all I have to do is give up and run away. Whereas what we can do is we can open a whole field to dogs. If people are using this at a contrast, that's the devil in you that's doing that. That's something wrong with you. What we're doing is we're opening a field of experiences to a dog that it may never have had experience before, and we're teaching that dog to have plasticity in its brain that it can think, okay, well, that was possible, and I overcome that, and my team have supported me so well in every other experience that I've done, so why wouldn't I trust my team? That's what people do around them. It's like, again, mate, to use your army experience, when you know that you're working with a crack team of people, if you see your assignment coming forward and you're with those type of people, you think to yourself, this is a fucking team of A-listers. Anytime I ship out with these guys or whoever this team might be, I know shit's going to get done. The objective is going to get met. The job is going to get done. Versus when you see the B team of people and you think, oh, fuck, this is going to go sideways for me. And dogs feel that way too. Yeah. They know when you're incompetent. They know when you're weak. They know that about their own pack structure as well. When they're working within something, they're constantly analyzing who you are and what you're capable of. And if they know this is a runaway situation, because that's what the team advocates for, then they'll run away from it. They'll just think, why learn? Why try? Running away is the option. I think this is why we see so much wastage in dogs, is because we're teaching dogs far too often that the runaway concept is the way to do it. Sometimes runaway is the answer. I'm not saying go forward as a sledgehammer. What I'm saying is sometimes, like Kenny Rogers said, he was a wise man, know when to hold him and know when to fold him. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah. All right. That's it.
Yep.
We did it. We won.
We did.
Another episode.
We beat the interweb.
We did it. Hey, if you guys like this kind of show, just tell someone else. Tell a friend. Be like, hey, I like this. You could do that digitally. You could maybe, like, if you're listening, you could just snap a little screenshot of your phone and post it on your story, post it on the X platform.
The X platform.
I'm a big user of the X platform currently. Yeah, I'm obsessed. I don't post anything. It turns out at a time when the world's falling apart, I enjoy having access to information.
You know what I'm an advocate for these days? People making better choices in the kibbles that they use.
Oh, yeah.
You have a good think about it, because that's my shtick for this year.
That's the bee that's in your bonnet?
It's not a bee. It's something that I actually see. Like, my own eyes visibly see transformations happening when people make better choices in what they're putting into their dog's stomach. What goes into your stomach fuels your brain. So up to you. It's the same for us. I've often talked about kibble types in the past. If you want to know, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you about it. I won't burn holes in whole episodes of podcasts because you'll think, oh, here he goes. Trust me, I'm talking about advocacy for dogs. If you want to advocate for your dog, there are so many better ways to do it, not only in the training concepts that we use, but also in what we're actually feeding. And this can be done budget friendly as well. So we don't have to talk about going into any mindless costs where you're thinking, fuck, like it's getting impossible.
Maybe we're due to have Narelle come on again and go through all that, because it's been a few years since we've talked about it, and there's probably stuff that's changed.
There's a lot of stuff that's changed. She's always researching, and she's a beast of information on what she actually knows. She's just got a plethora of knowledge there the burden of knowledge is making sure that you don't take it to your grave.
All right, so you've screenshotted it, you've posted it on the X platform or whatever platform
You stuck
you're on.
your greasy, dirty
everywhere.
earwax lidden earpod into somebody's ear while you sit next to them on a bus.
You've told a friend, tell a stranger, bring it up at Christmas the same way I wouldn't shut up about aliens and drones and shit. Everyone. Oh, mate, I was the family pariah. I was like, you guys aren't paying attention.
Yep.
My own family were like, shut up.
Yep.
Especially my own kids were like, we're so sick of hearing about this. All right, so do that.
They won't
If
be
you
when
want
the
to pull
apocalypse comes and they need someone to
Yeah.
run to for help, though.
Oh, mate, I'm going to be the guy. I told you so. To the
Yeah,
point
you
where
just
the
sit in your
aliens
bunker
will be like, "No, don't take
wave
me
to
with
them
us.
with the, outside the window going, sorry.
Only believers on board.
Yep.
Bye. I'm being rescued. You have to stay here for the nuclear war. Okay, so if you want to support the show, best way to do that is to jump in Patreon. You could give us a few bucks in there. Lots of information, huge backlog of stuff, new stuff going forward. I know I've said this, but I was sick all week, so Theo hasn't been in to finish the edit. But I have made the final box video, and I'm going to put it into Patreon before I put it anywhere else.
Nice.
It's an hour and a half long. It's like full explanation of all the theory with practical, the whole lot. I'm going to call it, don't ever fucking ask me questions about the box again. Watch this video. Then it's going into Patreon the moment it's done. Maybe even by the time you're hearing this, I don't know. It might be.
Yeah, nice.
It's done. It's just a couple of little bits of graphics that need to go in the edit. So Patreon, jump into there. You could pay more or less, whatever you want. And there's different stuff. If you want to buy some cool merch, that'd be cool too. You could get a t-shirt, tapestry, something like that. If you feel like we've helped you in an indirect way, you could help us in a direct way by buying some of that crap and whacking it on your wall, wearing it around. We love it. If you want to get in contact with us, best way to do that is to jump into the Facebook discussion group. There's lots of cool stuff happening in there, people answering each other's questions. And when we're looking to see what's going on in the zeitgeist and what we should talk about, that's where we go to look. So jump into there, have your say, be nice and kind to everybody. And if you want to get in touch with us directly, we are info@thecanineparadigm.com. Hey, everybody, just be cool out there. It's a stressful time, but just know that you are loved. Goodbye.
Oh,